G'day and welcome to the Seacreatures Podcast, a show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. Each episode we talk about a specific sea creature with a guest who has spent time and interacted with this ocean animal. Our guests range from marine biologists, underwater photographers, citizen scientists, scuba divers, and anyone with an intense passion for marine life. My name's Testoni, and I'm all of the above. And joining me for this episode of the Seacreatures Podcast is zoologist Olly, and we're going to be talking all about shearwaters. Welcome to the show, Olly.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
No worries. And just before we start, also, I asked Olly what she wanted to be kind of like mentioned as on the show, and she had a very good answer. What was it?
A zoologist.
Had to include that. All right. So get us started by telling us how you kind of got involved in shearwaters.
Ooh, that's a fun question because it sort of is it's almost a decade and a half long story. I knew I wanted to be a zoologist since I was around 15. I wanted to work with animals, but not as most people around me wanted to be a vet. I was like, nah, sick animals aren't for me, but very much want to work with all kinds of animals. And then in my undergraduate class, I studied zoology, and I really liked the study of avian flight, but almost more from a science media and science communication. So I did, instead of a research honours, my equivalent was actually writing a children's book about a pigeon learning to fly. So very different to what I do now. But then I tapped out of academia. I was like, it's not for me, but ended up coming back in to do a master's. And during that master's, I went to Madagascar to study plovers, which is, I studied 3 species of plovers, and they're a shorebird. And I loved it. I loved the field work. I loved working with the birds. And I was like, yes, I want to do more of this. I want to study more birds. And I think I am ready to go back and do a PhD. And I wanted to come back to Australia. So I'm originally from the UK. And while I studied abroad here during undergrad and came back for a year after my bachelor's, I was desperate to come back for longer. So I was looking at a lot of PhD projects here, and one thing led to another, and I ended up at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. And so I currently study the behavior of short-tailed shearwaters and little penguins.
That's so cool. So let's get into what exactly a shearwater is, because if you don't, they're a seabird, and that's the main thing I think a lot of people would know. But like, kind of run us through everything from like how they're different to other seabirds to like what's really special about them. What are they exactly?
Well, shockingly, before I started my PhD, I actually had never heard of a shearwater, which I think surprises a lot of people, because when you work in the world of seabirds, there's a sort of an expectation that you know everything about every single seabird, which I can 100% confirm is not true. So I had never heard of a shearwater, and they're neither a set of shears nor are they water. But they are this wonderful type of bird, and the short-tailed shearwater, or the fancy scientific name being Ardena tenurostrus, say that 5 times fast. But what's exciting about them is that they are not big at all. From the end of their tail to their bill, they're not that much more than your regular ruler, 30 centimeter ruler. They're not particularly big, but they do one of the largest migrations of all seabirds. So they breed here in Australia and Tasmania every year. They're actually incredibly abundant. They're one of the most abundant seabirds in Australia, and they breed in their colonies on islands around mainlands. In the wintertime, they actually migrate all the way up past Japan to the Bering Sea, which is a huge migration, and they do it en masse. And when they return, one thing that local Tassie's listeners might know about them is that sometimes you find these collections called wrecks, which is where a lot of birds have washed up altogether on the shoreline because they've starved on their way back. And so when I started my PhD in 2019, there had been a particularly large mass mortality. And sometimes it's just as it is, but it can also be a signal of how much prey they managed to find on their journey, their body condition when they left the Northern Hemisphere. There are different factors. But when they're breeding here in Tasmania, another really cool thing about them is that I study their local foraging in the waters around their islands and around Southeast Tassie, but they sometimes go on field trips themselves to Antarctica, and they can get all the way to Antarctica and back in just 2 weeks, which, as I said, they're not a big bird, but they are an incredible flyer, and they're also an incredible diver, so they can kind of do the best of both worlds.
Yeah, wow. It's amazing to think they go to the Arctic Circle with like Japan and Siberia and Antarctica. Like, that just blows my mind. So, like, I've got so many questions, but why are they going to Antarctica? To feed, I presume. What are they eating?
Yes, so they eat, their diet is a mixture of your krill, your fish species, and their two main provisioning strategies during the breeding season are those short local trips and those long Antarctic trips. There's the theory that is around these two trips is that the short local trips are mostly for provisioning their young. So earlier on in the chick rearing, the shearwaters actually have a really set schedule, and they tend to lay their eggs all at the same time. So studying them is actually quite useful because you know when there's going to be chicks around. But earlier on, when the chicks are smaller, they're more likely to be going in local waters because they can come back regularly to the chick. Like when a chick's young, you can't really leave it for 2 weeks. You have to be feeding it more regularly than that. But as the breeding season goes on, the adult's own body condition, because they'll have been using up the food that they find more for their young, they need to have a bit of me time. They need to have some R&R. And so those Antarctic trips are theorized to be more for aiding in their own body conditioning. And the Antarctic krill that they have, you can see lots of pink poo in the colony when they come back. It's quite funny. But it's a really good resource for them.
And do they still feed their chicks when they come back? Or
yeah, probably, but it depends how much is still sort of around, or they might do another little local trip before coming back to the colony. So shearwaters, you might have heard of the term a raft. So that's when there's a whole big group of seabirds in the water all together, and you can just see them bobbing about. They look like debris, or like, what's the word for like the wood, like driftwood. Yes, exactly. Cool. So from afar they just look like clumps of driftwood. But yeah, so they might then come back from one of those trips, hang out from a raft, do a bit more local foraging, and then go back to the chick, or they might go straight through. That's the thing with zoology. While we can study a few individuals at a time, there is still always going to be the difference between how each shearwater acts.
Yeah, and so they live on islands. Do you think that there are differences between the groups on the islands?
Yeah, quite possibly. So I study one island in particular. So I kind of only really know about my beloved Wedge Island birds. And even within the Wedge Island birds, I study one particular part of that colony. There's about 25,000 breeding pairs since the last estimate. And I, unsurprisingly, have not met every single one of those 50,000 birds. But yeah, there's very likely to be differences. And another exciting thing about shearwater is that they return to the same island each year. So there's an island off Flinders Island where they've been studying the colony there for 70 years. And there's a really common practice in ornithology is banding of birds. So that's when a bird is big enough, you can put a metal band on the leg with an ID, which means for the rest of its life, if it's ever caught, you can see what the bird is, who the bird is. And shearwater bands are really awful to put on because they're a funny shape. They're like an awful oval shape, whereas most bird bands are round and easier. But the exciting thing is with that colony, because it's been going for 70 years and the birds return to the same colony every year, they're able to track families for several generations. And it's this huge demographic study. And in ecology, 70 years worth of continuous data is a very rare thing.
What have they found? Like, what's a big thing they've found from that you wouldn't have found on your study?
One thing I can say for certain is it's not a big island. It's a very small island. So I said that Wedge Island has 25,000, an estimated 25,000 breeding pairs. This island is teeny, teeny, tiny. Maybe has 100 or something, like nowhere near the same scale. So if there's a threat from a predator or if there's a mass death event, that kind of colony, it would be at much more threat than Wedge Island, and then you'd end up with a sort of bottleneck of genetics going forward and all of those things. So I think the only thing I know conclusively about that island is that it needs higher protection, or
because it's smaller. So
it's more vulnerable. Yeah.
Ah, cool. And so what I really want to know is, we're talking about these islands and they're studying, but what's it like actually like working with the birds, or like banding them, or being there? Like, tell us what the experience is like.
Oh my gosh, it's my favorite question. I love talking about fieldwork. I could talk about fieldwork for forever, so stop me at any point. But listeners, you can't see, but I have some scars on my arms from birds. And so there's one on my left from a penguin bite, and then one on my right from a shearwater claw.
So they're quite like 5 to 10 centimeter like little scars up and down the arm.
There's one that's a nice little zigzag like Harry Potter's lightning bolt over there. So that's what it's like working with them, but I love it because they are burrowing birds. So short-tailed shearwaters actually live underground, and so obviously it's all done with ethics and permits. I would never suggest to anyone that you should just go out and do this, because that's wrong for a multitude of reasons. But if there is a shearwater that you're studying and you need to take it out of the burrow, you put your hand in and you have to remove the bird, and that brings about scars. And I have a bunch of photos of me in bushes and in a myriad of positions, because trying to balance my weight. And shearwaters are great diggers as well, so sometimes they have a little U-bend in the burrow that you have to get round, and their bill is actually a hook bill. While their bite isn't as strong as the penguins that I work with, they can do a nasty dig in that the penguins don't do. The penguins is like a firm, whereas the shearwaters are a dig. So they're the specifics of what they feel like.
And I'm just trying to imagine it. So you've put your hand in there and it's the hook bill that's getting you. And I presume you can't really see. Like, is it just a blind arm into a burrow?
Yeah, it is.
And do you know if they're in there every time?
Not always, no. So you tend to, because obviously Tasmania has a few snake species as well. And I've worked on a couple of islands where there are known snakes. You tend to go in with a stick very slowly. So you tap around the entrance and you tap a little deeper. You obviously don't shove it in, because then you could hit the shearwater. So it's a very delicate, soft move. They say, I've never come across a snake in a burrow, but they say it often feels cold and damp. And if there's a bird in there, there is no snake. So it's nice when you know there's a bird in there. And shearwaters, they have this wonderful, depending on what part of the season it is, when it's closer to the incubation, so they're looking after their egg still, they have this a very fine tap, 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 tap dance you have. So if you're lying down on the ground and the burrow is longer than the hand and the stick, and you can't quite know if there's a bird in there, you might hear the tap, 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 and you can hear that they're in there, which is pretty awesome. And a penguin, just for comparison, they have shallower burrows and they squawk so loudly. So you know immediately if it's a penguin burrow, but for a shearwater, you could be there for longer.
Oh, wow. So when you actually go to these burrows, it could be a penguin one from like the surface. You could be like, oh, is it a penguin or a shearwater?
Yeah. So the amazing thing about those two species is that they have overlapping colonies. They actually live sympatrically with one another. And I've seen some really funny rental disputes between the two species across my time. One, adult penguins and adult shearwaters, they return at nighttime to the colony, and so that's when we mostly work. And I was walking in the colony one time and I came across, it was so funny, but there was these two, I sort of call them teenager penguin chicks because they're a bit older. They're sitting outside, they're loitering, waiting for mum and dad to bring them food. And then the adult came home and they were having a big squabble. But then a shearwater needed to pass them because the penguin burrow was on top of the shearwater burrow. It was like a block of apartment flats, and the shearwater had to try and get past these rowdy teenage penguin chicks. And then the adult was having a go at the shearwater, and the shearwater was like, just let me get home. My chick needs feeding.
So that's fantastic. I love it. Like a little bird apartment block with a bit of a fight. So But one like so because the burrows like are like almost 2 meters. Do they ever steal each other's burrows?
Oh, for sure. The penguins would steal the shearwater burrows more than the shearwaters would steal the penguins, I would think, because penguins are a bit more of an aggressive bird and shearwaters can dig well, and because they can fly, they don't have to walk from the water to the burrow each time. So while the colonies overlap, the penguin burrows are closer to the water, whereas the shearwaters are on the higher, my island, Wedge Island, I should say, is up on a slope. So you'll see the shearwaters will just sort of drift upwards. And I think it would be really interesting, or it's a shame that in the 70-year data set, they didn't actually measure the depth of the burrows, because it would have been really cool to see if the influence, there are a few studies on the human influence of investigated disturbance on seabirds, and I wonder if burrows in a colony that's regularly visited by humans, if those burrows are getting deeper.
So you think they're digging further in to avoid people like yourself with sticks and there?
Yeah, exactly, because sometimes you go and you need to work with a particular nest and you can hear the bird digging to get away from you.
Oh, wow. And do they have the same nest? Because they have the same partner most years, don't they?
Yes, and I think there is nest reuse from year to year. But sometimes in different colonies, the ground is very weak. And the main risk that we have when we're moving through the colonies, the main risk that we pose on the birds is collapsing burrows, which is a horrible instance. It's something that happens to every shearwater researcher at one time, and you have to dig it out immediately, but sometimes the ground is very weak. That's why on Wedge Island we have a particular section of the island that we know is safe to work in, because other parts the ground is just too weak. You have to sort of be crawling around on all fours.
Oh wow.
So from year to year, when the birds return from their migration, the nest that they previously used might not be viable anymore, or it might.
Yeah, wow. I've just so many questions about nests. But I also want to talk about, so once they've like had their chick and then they migrate back, how long does the migration go for? And like, are they eating on the way? I know you kind of said that yes, but tell us a bit more.
Yes. So I don't know extensively about the migration. They would be eating on the way back because it is a long journey. They're arriving back in Tassie maybe November time. I have some collaborators that study what they're doing in the Northern Hemisphere, but I don't know the particular dates of when they leave there and then come back. So I don't know the conclusive answer.
Well, I've got another one for you. Mm-hmm. When they go north, where do they sleep? Like, because they don't have a burrow.
In rafts. Or
in the water, so they're not flying up to like Japan and Siberia and landing on the shore or an island.
They probably do. I think they do use the islands up there as well. But as I said, I don't know particularly about the Northern Hemisphere use. The funny thing about doing a PhD is that you end up knowing an unreasonable amount of a very niche bit of science. And so, yeah, there's a lot about the shorties that eludes me. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
How about their diving? Do you know much about their diving, or like tell us, like, because I was reading that they eat both from like foraging on the surface, but also from diving. Tell us a little bit about that.
So diving is what I study. Woohoo! And I love to say that I'm Olly Dove, or you could say Olly dove into diving behavior of birds. You know, there's a lot of puns available with the name. But yes, so they do surface feeding as well as that diving. So they're pelagic feeders, so they feed in the open water. And they've been recorded to dive maybe up to 70 meters. Of the birds that I've collected data from, my deepest one was 52 meters. So they're getting over 50 meters below sea level, but most of their feeding occurs within the top 20 meters of the water column. There's several different types of dives that you can do. You can do that, you're sort of bopping about on the surface, and then you do a sort of duck dive, or there's the plunge dive from flying in. They also have this sort of the movement where you're moving slower and sort of investigating an area before you find a good prey spot. One thing that I'm trying to do in my PhD is classify the underwater behaviors, because we can't see what they're doing. We're not out there with them. But you can attach these devices called accelerometers to their backs, as well as GPS and pressure sensors. And from those 3 bits of data, we can record where they're diving. And we can also draw up these things called dive profiles. Various different papers have classified various different species with various different types of dive types. There is no sort of set golden standard of movement underwater. But in general, you have dives. The easiest way to classify them is that you have V dives, so down and up immediately. U dives, which look like a U, so they're like a V, but more gradual. And W dives. So you go down, you do wiggle behavior or oscillate on the deepest section of your dive, and then come back up. And the V and U dives can suggest more traveling or searching behavior, whereas the W dives might be more prey capture attempt.
Okay, so like the W dives is maybe when there's like a school of fish and they're like seeing it, they're like, I've got this, whereas the U dive is like maybe they're kind of chasing a squid or something.
Yeah, or just looking around the area. Yep, you can definitely see. It's very exciting when you see a massive U dive that went to like 40 meters and you're just like, wow, that bird was just chilling and just doing a big search. But then the W dives, when you can see a bird's moving very quickly up and down in different directions, that does suggest that it's chasing something.
Yeah. And like, how long do these dives go for?
Well, the 52-meter dive that I mentioned before was around 90 seconds. So that was also the longest dive that I have on record. But a dive can be as short as 4 seconds. Most of them would be under a minute long, because then a shearwater is eventually going to run out of oxygen, and also they have to overcome their own buoyancy. There's various factors which mean that they won't be able to stay underwater indefinitely.
And so they've dived down, they've gotten all wet, they've come back to the surface. Can they then fly off straight away again, or how does that work?
Yeah, they do this sort of funny run along the surface to take off sort of thing.
Yeah.
It is funny watching them try and take off on land, because they're not graceful on land. Their wings stick out. They're so ungraceful. And yet when they're flying, beautifully graceful. Flying and diving, because I've seen some video captures of them diving. They look amazing, but then it's that takeoff stage. And I recently went to Matsaika Island to do some volunteering there, and there's this one section where it's an old helicopter pad, but basically there's a track and then the birds take off, but they take off from there in the hundreds and the thousands. So we went out at about 4 a.m. and we sat there to watch the birds fly, and it was just incredible. It was like watching something from Star Wars where all like the X-Wings take off at the same time, because they just all in their hundreds ran down this ramp and then like ran off to the edge of this cliff and took off. And sometimes they didn't make it. Sometimes they had to then come back and go again.
Oh, wow. Like, so when you say they didn't make it, do they like, what happened?
Like sort of maybe would flap a couple of times and didn't have enough speed, or was like, I feel like chickened out would be the wrong phrase to use because they're not a chicken, but maybe rethought their actions and came back.
Wow. And so once they've like gone off and they're flying, I was reading that they're kind of called shearwaters or shearwaters because they kind of shear across the waves, don't they? Like, how does that work? Or describe them flying for us.
Ooh. So the main times that I've seen shearwaters flying is when they come back at nighttime. So shearwaters have a fairly reliable, if the sun sets around 8 a.m., you'll start seeing a few, and then by 8 p.m., by 8:15 and 8:20, bam, the sky's full of them, because there's sort of that sweet spot where there's enough light to come back, but not enough light to be predated upon by bigger birds.
Yeah, what's predating on them? Is it like eagles?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, so, yep, those eagles can grab them. And unfortunately, we found carcasses amongst the colony. There's a couple of wedge-tailed eagles that live on wedge as well, which is not why it's called wedge. It's shaped like a wedge. There's a lot of wedges. But yeah, and once came across a half-eaten one, which was very unfortunate, very sad. But eagles got to eat, just like shearwaters got to catch fish. So, circle of life and all that. But yeah, so they come back, and then when they're in the air, you can have hundreds above your head, and yet they don't collide. They don't make much sound either. They're perfectly silent, and it looks like the sky is filled with massive flies, or it's like a huge swarm, but in a very swift and graceful version.
Yeah, sounds kind of like eerily beautiful to watch.
It's gorgeous. It's my favorite part of the fieldwork, and it only really lasts 5-10 minutes.
Wow.
Of when it's like at its peak with the most amount of birds that you'll see, and then they sort of land on the colony, on the bushes, and they go into their burrows, and then they get real loud, very loud. They lose all that grace. There's a lot of squawking, potentially partner talking to partner sort of thing, and then around 4 a.m. again, the colony comes alive, and it's squawk time.
Wow, and because all those birds that are coming back together, they'd be like coming from different places, wouldn't they?
Yeah, or they might have been offshore in a raft together. Sort of, they'll come together at the end of the day and then fly in together, strength in numbers sort of thing. So again, using penguin as a comparison, the shearwaters dives that I've seen, they don't necessarily all forage together as a cohort. Some will go up the east coast, some will go down to the southwest, and they sort of dive within these bouts, so like groups of dives, whereas the penguins will all go to the same area, or at least the penguins that I've recorded, they go to the same area and they dive throughout the day on the way there and on the way back. So the two birds are behaving very differently, but yeah, both return at night.
Wow, that's so cool. Well, just before we kind of finish up, we've got a few last things. Mm-hmm. But if people want to see shearwaters, or short-tailed shearwaters, what's the easiest way to do so?
Ooh, that's such a good question. I feel like go on a bird watching cruise to see them at sea, but now is not a good time of year because it's winter, so they've gone up north. So you'd want to be going between that November to March period.
Oh wow, so if you live near like a shearwater colony, you can actually see them all coming back even if you're not on the island.
Oh yeah, but because Wedge Island is just off Nubina and Roaring Beach, and I think if you were in White Beach you'd be able to see them, I mean through binoculars. I think you'd have to be in the water closer to the island to have the same effect. But yeah, and then the NRE website might have more advice on where shearwater colonies are and those sort of things. And I know down on Bruni they do penguin talks, so you can watch the penguins come back. They come back around 2 hours after nightfall, a bit later than the shearwaters. But I reckon there'd definitely be some organizations around coastlines.
Yeah. And do you have any cool facts about shearwaters?
Cool facts.
We've covered quite a few already, I guess, like how deep they dive and all that stuff. Yeah. But or anything really unusual where you're just like, this made no sense.
Well, one thing I forgot to mention, I haven't mentioned at all, is that they're also called mutton birds because they're a commercially harvested bird. So they're hugely important for the Aboriginal community, and they've been harvested for years, and so each year there's annual counts of the shearwater populations, and from that annual count you can have a quota for how many birds can be harvested. So on Flinders, harvesting's a big thing, and you have to have a license to be a mutton birder. But yeah, so I am yet to actually eat mutton bird.
So it's all for food. They're harvesting for food.
And oils, I think, because so it's the juvenile shearwaters that get harvested because they're just sitting in their burrow and they've got no defense. And I've heard that the mutton bird meat is very fatty because They're so funny. Shearwater chicks, they look like they have a mullet. They're like literally just a ball of fluff, and they have this really shaggy hairstyle. It's so funny. They're so cute, but they're so big. They get to over double the adult's weight by the end of being reared, because there's a period where they're no longer being fed yet while they're getting their adult feathers. So they're huge, to the point where sometimes if you need to weigh a juvenile and it's later on in the season, you can barely get them out of the burrow because they fill the whole thing.
Wow, that is a cool fact.
Yeah, and so because they're fatty, their oils are also used in various things. But there's a limit to how many can be harvested each year, so the population can continue.
Wow. Well, it's been pretty awesome chat. If anyone wants to hear more about Shearwaters or learn more about your research or listen to the podcast which you are a host of, how can they do that, and where should they go and what should they do?
Well, as you said, I'm involved in a podcast called That's What I Call Science. So each week I'm part of a bigger team, and each week we interview either research professional or researcher here in Tasmania that works in either science, technology, engineering, maths, or medicine. And we really like to focus on Tasmanian work to big up what we're doing here on the island. And so our website is thatscience.org with 2 S's in the middle, or if you search That's What I Call Science or That Science Tas on any social medias, you'll find us. Or my own Instagram is OLS_Dove.
Awesome. Well, thanks heaps for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Seacreatures Podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by myself, Matt Testoni. If you've liked the show, be sure to jump onto whatever service you're listening through and leave us a review. And don't forget to check out the Seacreatures Instagram, which is Seacreatures_podcast. Production assistance by George McGrath and music by the talented and amazing Dan Musil. If you've liked the show, jump onto our Patreon account or our Buy Me a Coffee account with links in the notes of the show. This just helps with our monthly running costs. Coming up next time on the Seacreatures Podcast, we're going to be talking all about the White's seahorse, a highly endangered seahorse found in Sydney Harbour. This has been the Seacreatures Podcast. Over and out.